Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. Round 12 of the Candidates Tournament. What a show Anish Giri is putting on, as today he faces Fabiano Caruana with the black pieces. So let's just jump straight into the game. We have e4 by Caruana, c5, and now that we have a Sicilian on the board, we're practically guaranteed a great battle here. Caruana continues with knight to f3. Giri goes for e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes on d4, knight to f6, putting pressure on the pawn on e4, knight to c3. This is all part of theory here. Giri continues with knight to c6, and here Caruana plays a3. The idea of this quiet move is that you want to prevent the lines in which this bishop pins the knight here with bishop to b4, which then targets the pawn on e4. And these lines are very difficult to play with white because black does get a quick d5 in with very interesting play. So Caruana plays a3, prevents this maneuver with bishop to b4. So Giri goes for bishop to e7. He is going to get now a setup similar to a Taimanov slash Sveshnikov here. So after bishop to e7, the game continues with bishop to e3. Both players continue to develop their pieces. Here, Giri castled, bishop to e2, and d6 on the board. And Caruana plays queen to d3. He's trying to stay very flexible. He's keeping the options to both castle queenside and castle kingside, at which point Giri is going to keep Giri's guessing and having to make a move in this position, which Giri does. He plays bishop to d7. All the options here will go to directly with pawn to a6 and pawn to b5 after a trade on d4, but this also stays very flexible with bishop to d7, just asking Caruana what he plans to do. And Caruana answers with pawn to f4, playing very aggressively. The ideas here are to go g4, g5. So Giri, anticipating all of that, goes for e5 himself, asking questions in this position. What is Caruana going to do? Caruana simply took the knight on c6. Giri took with the pawn. A very interesting move, because now if Caruana decides to castle queenside, then there's going to be this open b file for a rook and a queen to attack on. And because this pawn is on a3 already, this can create weaknesses in combination with pawn to d5 and sacrifices with bishop takes on a3 as well. So very dangerous for Caruana to castle queenside now that the pawn has taken on c6. The other important thing about this pawn being on c6 is that it does control now the square on b5 and d5. So this knight on c3 is going to have a hard time getting into the game now. So after b takes on c6, Caruana decides to castle kingside. As we mentioned, castling queenside was going to be very difficult and very dangerous for him. And here Giri goes for e takes f4. A very interesting move that sort of simplifies the position. And a lot of people were thinking that now after this capture on f4, the game might fizzle out into a draw. But Giri at the moment, he doesn't want to risk much. He's in a very good place in the tournament, and a draw for him will be a very good result. And it will be up to Caruana to have to prove that he needs to win. He needs to get a lot of wins in order to catch up to first place Nepomniachtchi. So after he takes on f4, bishop takes on f4, and now there's a lot of pressure on the pawn on d6, as you can see, with both the bishop and queen hitting that square. So Giri goes for bishop to e6, and now the queen joins in on the protection of the pawn on d6. Caruana switches plans. He goes queen to g3, still keeping an eye on the d6 square, but now there's also options to go bishop to h6 with the g7 threat on here on g7. So here Giri has a couple of options. He can play a very slow knight to e8, protecting the square on g7, or he can go for a more direct approach, which he chooses. He goes for knight to d7. And it looks like this pawn here on d6 is hanging. You can try going bishop takes on d6, bishop takes and queen takes, but this doesn't really work because there is this queen b6 in the end, which is a check on the king, and also taking the pawn on b2. And if this would happen, black would be in a very great position, because then the knight will be hanging, the pawn on c2 will be hanging. This would be a very nice game for black here. So of course, this doesn't happen. So after knight to d7, instead what Caruana played was rook a to d1. He continues to add pressure to this pawn on d6, and just rook to e8 by Giri. The same problem. You can go ahead and take everything on d6, but at the end there's going to be the queen to b6 taking the pawn on b2. So at the moment, the pawn on d6, you cannot really take it. So what does Caruana do? Well, a prophylaxis move. He goes king to h1, and now there's no longer any checks on b6. So this pawn on d6 is actually hanging on a time. So here Giri just goes queen to b8. Now the queen is protecting the pawn, but it's also hitting the pawn on b2. So if Caruana decides to take on d6, the pawn on b2 will hang in the end, as all the lines that we mentioned. So Caruana solves this problem with pawn to b4. And this is the start of probably all the problems for Caruana, pushing this pawn to b4. Maybe he should have gone for pawn to b3, which would be a slower option. And at least you control some key squares here, and you're still putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on d6. And it's not so clear how Giri was going to solve that problem. But okay, Caruana goes for b4. And now this pawn on d6 is really hanging. So he goes knight to e5 and he gets in the way. Now if bishop takes, pawn takes, and it will be black with a very great position here. So Caruana doesn't go for that. Instead, he goes for b5. He wants to undermine this pawn here in order for him to get access to the d5 square for his knight. If pawn takes, then there's options. You can go bishop takes, attack the rook, then retreat your bishop back, and at the end you will have this d5 square, which was his entire plan. But now this gives Giri very good chances to attack down the c file, and he takes that opportunity right away. He goes rook to c8. Caruana took the pawn, the rook took the pawn, and notice now that this rook puts a lot of pressure down the c file. Here the game continued with knight to d5. Now this knight is attacking the bishop on e7, and you really don't want to give up your bishop for this knight, because after pawn takes, then this bishop here is just going to come to d3, and there's going to be a lot of threats on the king side. So you don't want to take this. So the moves here were to go a bishop to f8, keeping the bishop, or queen to f8, which is what Giri played. But now you do give Caruana the option of taking on e7, and this pawn on d6 is going to be a little bit weak. But Caruana doesn't do that. Instead, he goes for c3. He wants to keep the tension, and at the same time now he protected his pawn that was being attacked by this rook. But Giri takes this opportunity to double his rooks on the c file. And as you can see, it is Giri at the moment, the one that is holding all the cards in this game. Caruana continues rook to c1. He realizes that he has to play passive defense at the moment. The knight retreats to g6. Notice that Giri is going to be the one improving his position. He's threatening to just remove this bishop from the board, and then he would have the bishop pair in order to continue to attack. So the bishop retreats to d2, and here bishop to h4. Giri continues to push the white pieces back. Queen to e3 happening in this position, attacking the pawn on a7, and Giri solves that problem with rook to c5, and here rook to c4. The threat is simple. You want to play moves like bishop to b4, maybe bishop to c3, bishop to d4 here, but in this position, after rook to c5 and c4, we have h6, a masterful move by Giri. The idea is that you want to trade this bishop, and then there will be nothing attacking this rook on c5. Notice that most of white's plan is controlling the light square pieces, and the only piece that at the moment can get to the dark squares is this bishop. So if he's able to remove this bishop from the board and this knight from the board, then this knight against this bishop will be a dream scenario to play in this endgame. So that's exactly what Giri is aiming to do. So he goes h6. He's preparing to go bishop g5 and trade his dark square bishop for white's dark square bishop. So after h6, Caruana continues with queen to b3. He wants to activate the queen. Now there's possibilities of going queen to a4, targeting the pawn on a7. But bishop to g5 came anyways. There was a trade of bishops, h takes on g5, and here queen to g3. Caruana switches back. He puts pressure now on the pawn on g5. So Giri goes queen to d8, protects the pawn on g5. And here rook c to d1 happened. You can remove this rook now because the bishop is protecting the pawn on c4, and of course Giri is not going to play that move. So the bishop here at the moment does a very good job. So Caruana activates his rooks and puts it on d1. But here Giri goes bishop takes on d5, pawn takes on d5, and notice now that if this knight goes into any of these two dark squares, this bishop is never going to be able to challenge that knight. So that's what Giri does. He goes knight to f4. Some people were saying knight to e5 was better. I do agree with that. I think the knight on e5 does a much greater job. It protects the square on f7, and then you can slowly rearrange your pieces and start formulating an attack. But okay, Giri goes for knight to f4. There's nothing to say about the move. The move looks very good too. So after knight to f4, Caruana goes for queen to f2, and the idea is that if this knight takes on e2, for example, trying to win this pawn on c4, then he at least gets a perpetual check. For example, the line will go something like this: knight takes on e2, and of course you're not going to take this knight, allowing this rook to take on c4. You're just going to take on f7 first, and it doesn't matter where this king goes, h7 or h8, you're just going to be able to at least get a perpetual check. The king has to return, and then you have options. You can go for the perpetual check, or you can try to continue the game now that this black king is a lot weaker, and just go ahead and capture this knight. And actually, this is exactly what I would do, because this king looks just really bad. So Giri was not going to go for this. So after queen to f2, instead he chooses and he goes for another plan. He goes for rook 8 to c7. Now, in some situations, he can go ahead and take on e2, because this rook is protecting on f7. So Caruana needs to be a bit careful on what to do here, and he goes rook to d4. Now the pawn on c4 is protected, so if knight takes on e2, queen takes on e2, and then you're no longer dropping the pawn on c4. So after this, rook to d4, Giri continues with queen to e2. Now there's two pieces attacking here, the bishop on e2 here with queen to e8, sorry, and he goes bishop to f3. The rook now takes on c4, because there's no longer this protection here. Rook takes on c4, rook takes on c4, and after all of this, Giri has won a pawn. And he goes queen to a7, thinking that he was going to be able to recuperate his pawn, but after rook to a4, he ended up having to return to f2. And there's a very nice idea here. If he goes queen to c7, thinking, okay, after rook takes on a3, you can take on d6 and then life will be good. But then there's this nasty little rook takes on f3, and the rook cannot take because of background checkmate. So you would have to take with the pawn, but anyways, queen to e2 is coming. You're hitting the rook, you're hitting checkmate on g2, and this rook cannot come to g1 to protect because you take on f3, and after rook comes to g2, there will be checkmate there. So you couldn't go for this. So Caruana just ended up being down a pawn after rook to a4. He needed to return to f2. So after queen to f2, rook took on a3, and here Caruana tries to complicate things by playing this move pawn to h4. He wants to undermine the protection of this very nice knight on f4. Now if the pawn takes, queen can take, and this knight is no longer protected by anybody, but of course a pawn is a pawn, and still it will be a very long game. But after h4, queen to e5 happened. Now if you take the pawn, the queen can take back. So after this happened, there was a very nice positional sacrifice here that could have happened. So if bishop to d1, thinking, okay, I'm hitting this knight, and if you move it, I'm going to take on f7. Well, there was a very nasty move here. After queen to h6, this king has to come to g1 and rook to h3, threatening checkmate in one move. And you cannot take this knight because you go rook h1, and after the king comes here, you have this intermediate queen takes on f4, and then you're going to take the rook anyway. This would have been game over. So after queen to takes on g5, you couldn't play this bishop to d1, and I think Caruana absolutely missed this. But in this position, he continued to try it. He went rook to e1, and both players were very low on time here as they were trying to reach time control. And in this position, Giri just played rook to a8 and bishop to e4. And you will see this position again, because here in this position, the best move to play was going to be f5, as Giri ended up playing later on. But instead, in his last move here, he played rook to a2, attacking this queen, and the queen can't really take because you end up dropping all the pieces. If you go queen takes on a2 here, you go queen h4 check, you attack the rook, and after this king moves, you take with check, and then you're going to end up taking on e4 as well. So this wasn't going to happen, but after rook to a2, hitting the queen here, Caruana played rook to b1 with a nasty rook to b8 checkmate threat. And Giri could have gone wrong here very quickly, thinking that queen to h6 check, for example, was possible. Here you can go rook to d1, and if you try some knight to e2, well, then you can go ahead and sacrifice your queen, because rook takes here is not possible because of this background checkmate. So this could have been a way for Giri to go wrong. But of course, after rook to a8, He then repeated the position. Here, Caruana went back to rook to e1, and Giri doesn't miss the chance this time around. He goes f5, and here the bishop goes to b1, and after king to f7, the game finished swiftly after rook to e3, trying to activate the rook down this file here. Giri continued with rook to h8, and after king to u1, knight takes on g2 happened on the board, and here Caruana resigned the game. The reason for that is now two pieces are attacking this rook, and if you move this rook from here, then this discovered check with the knight followed by some rook to h1 will be checkmate, and you can't really do anything. The other move will be to take on f5, but then queen takes on f5, bishop takes on f5, and this knight's just going to take on e3. It's game over. So anyway, Caruana ended up resigning this position, and now Giri has put himself in a great position to catch up to the leader Nepomniachtchi, and who knows, tomorrow we're going to have Nepo against Bashir, and anything could happen in that game because even MVL is back into the mix after he won today. So a great result by Anish. He's playing great chess at the moment, and I would love to see that matchup between Anish and Magnus in the World Championship. That would be absolutely amazing. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed the game. As I did, as always, stay safe, have a great day, show respect to your opponent. See you on the next one.